legislation statutory.
Got it. That's what I was thinking. Howdy, Ken.
I'd like to welcome everyone today to the second meeting of the year of the PPOB. It's 1 o'clock, so I'd like to get started on time if we could. I would recommend to everyone as they walk in, as you're sitting, if you would silence or mute your cell phones. And at this time, Madam Clerk, if you call the roll, please.
Senator Berg. Senator Carroll.
Here.
Senator McDaniel. Senator Mills. Senator Neal. Senator Nemus.
Present.
Senator Wilson.
Here.
Senator Bojanowski.
Representative Bojanowski?
I'm
here.
sorry.
Yes.
Excuse me.
We will not demote you today.
Representative Fleming. Representative Graham.
Present.
Representative Petrie.
Here.
Representative Pratt.
Here.
Representative Tipton.
Here.
Representative Weber.
Here.
Mike Harmon. John Hicks. Victor Maddox. Sharon Mattingly. Senator Higdon. Representative Johnson.
Here. Got a quorum, right? Mm-hmm. So we do have a quorum and are duly constituted to do business today. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes from the January meeting? We have a motion and a second. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? The minutes are approved. So the next item on our agenda is to get into our actual business of the day, and we're going to start off with the actuarial valuation audit that has been completed. It's going to be presented by Mr. Scott Porter and Daniel Wade of Milliman Actuarial Consulting. Gentlemen, if you would come forward. And as they come forward, just a quick reminder that the reason that we're having this report today is it's basically a second set of eyes on our actuarial procedures. And this is created per the statute of the PPOB that the PPOB retains a responsibility to perform the audit, which we began discussing in 2021 for those that were here. And it's been progressing up until today through 2022. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me?
If you would introduce yourselves for the record,
Yeah,
please.
will do.
One last thing, make sure the green light's on.
So I am Scott Porter,
And I'm Daniel Wade.
and we're actuaries with Millman here today to discuss our findings of the actuarial audits of the Kentucky statewide retirement systems. In addition to Dan and myself, Nick Collier and Aaron Shapiro were also principal actuaries who assisted us on the audit, and along with a team of actuaries and analysts that assisted us. Before we get started, I would like to thank the staffs of each of the systems and the actuarial firms, along with Jennifer and Brad. As you can imagine, completing an actuarial audit requires many pieces of information, and especially for systems as complex as these, numerous questions are needed to ensure our understanding of the various provisions, assumptions, and statute. So we sincerely appreciate their assistance. We're happy to take questions along the way on our presentation today. There's an old adage that if you provide two actuaries with the same data, facts, and circumstances to a situation, that each one is going to produce a different result. In performing an audit, we attempted to focus on those aspects of the systems and its actual functions that could be meaningfully improved or where an alternative approach may be beneficial or considered. The presentation highlights our key comments made in the actual audit report, but the report does include various other comments and suggestions. So with that, we'll go to page 2. So what is the purpose of an actual audit? So we performed an independent full scope audit, meaning that we completed a full replication or parallel valuation of the liabilities and contributions for each of the systems for the retirement and insurance benefits. We also reviewed the experience studies, which represent a complete analysis by each of the system actuaries on the experience of the systems and form the basis for their recommended actuarial assumptions. In essence, we're providing opinion on the reasonableness and accuracy of the application of the actuarial assumptions, cost methods, valuation results, and contribution rates. Please note that our focus was on the 2021 actuarial valuations and do not reflect a review of the more recently released 2022 actuarial valuations. As you can see on the slide, we list all the different systems that were part of the audit. And so throughout our report, we refer to the state-administered Kentucky retirement systems, or the KYSRS as we indicated, to reflect all of the systems. And these included the systems that are administered by KPPA, which includes the Kentucky Employees Retirement System and the County Employees Retirement System, and that includes a hazardous and a non-hazardous portion, as well as then the State Police Retirement System. We also reviewed the Teachers Retirement System, and Dan was the lead actuary for that, and so his comments will be focused more on the Teachers Retirement System today. And then in addition, we reviewed the Judicial Form Retirement System, which includes both the Judicial Retirement Plan and the Legislator's Retirement Plan. So as we're performing an actuarial audit of all the systems at the same time, we feel this gave us what I would say is a rather unique perspective in seeing differences in assumptions, methods, and in approach across each of the systems and their actuaries. And while we believe the methods and approaches each system has taken are reasonable when viewed individually, some of our comments reflect those differences and if a common framework could be established. So we'll go to slide 3.
Great. I will talk about the audit scope. During the audit, we covered many different aspects of actuarial work. When you do an actuarial evaluation, there are many inputs that go into the model. First of the inputs is the census data used. We took the same raw demographic data provided by each system to each of the differing actuarial firms and did some analysis and some calculations to turn that data that was received from the systems into the data that was used for the actuarial evaluation. We compared our calculations to the data summaries provided by the actuaries and had good matches, as was shown in our audit report. One additional step that we did was a comparison of recent benefit calculations with the data provided to the actuary by each system. In our experience, this is not actually a common step when it comes to an actuarial audit, but it can reveal more information. And we will talk about what we did learn and what we did in a couple of slides. We also, as Scott referenced, we did a complete replication of all the actuarial liabilities and the normal costs. The normal costs are the costs allocated to a specific year based on the actuarial cost method. And we did this by taking all of the same inputs, all of the same data, all of the same actuarial assumptions, all the same actuarial methods, as well as the plan provisions, and we verified the plan provisions stated in the actuarial evaluation reports with the statute and with the member handbooks, and then we made sure that those provisions were incorporated in the calculations we did in our actuarial evaluation software. After feeling good about the liabilities, we move on to the asset side of things, and we use the income statement, balance sheet, and the asset valuation method to determine a smooth actuarial value of assets used in the funding calculations. There's a 5-year smoothing that's used, and that's done because there's so much volatility. If you took the market value of assets on a specific date for your funding calculations, there would be more volatility in the contribution rates. Then with the assets and the liabilities and the funding plans and the funding provisions, you can determine the funding computations and the contribution rates and allocation to employers. We then also looked and did a peer review of the experience studies establishing the recommendations for the actuarial assumptions on the economic side. Those include inflation, investment rate of return, interest credit, and salary growth. And then we also looked at the other broad type of actuarial assumptions. That's the demographic assumptions. That reflects when members terminate employment, when they retire, when they become disabled, and how long they're anticipated to live. In other words, the mortality assumption. And the very last thing that we did on this slide here is that we did an assessment of the compliance with the actuarial standards of practice, sometimes referred to as ASOPs.
Okay, so moving on to the next slide. Anytime you complete an audit, you tend to really focus on those aspects where we believe some modification in current procedures would be desirable. And we're going to have a handful of items that we're going to discuss today. But we do want to make sure that it's clear that our findings are such that this is a favorable review, that we found that the actual procedures and practices to be of a high quality and in compliance with all major aspects of the applicable actuarial standards for all of the systems. Now, the following points on this slide reflect our primary findings, and we're going to discuss these in additional detail in today's presentation. First, as we've mentioned a couple times, that we performed a full replication or a parallel valuation, and that indicated no significant deviation from the amounts calculated in the valuation. In fact, a couple of relatively small items that we found, that we noticed, they were actually corrected in the 2022 valuations. Now, since we were performing an audit of all the systems at once, we noticed differences in certain assumptions or methods used by each of the actuaries. And our suggestion is attempt to promote a consistency in that framework used, all the while reflecting each system's unique demographics and funding situations. And so we'll discuss these in our presentation today. Other specific items that we believe require additional study or modification include an increase in the assumed interest crediting rate for the hybrid plan benefits, a reduction in the inflation and investment return assumption for JFRS, and then a review of how the final average compensation should be accounted for in the actual valuation, specifically for certain members of SPRS, for state police. The two items that we note that we found on the bottom of the slide here, that we found in our audit, which was a correction to the valuation of non-hazardous benefits for retirees who had both a hazardous portion of a benefit and a non-hazardous portion of the benefit. And so this impacted KERS and CERS. And also we found that a mortality table was misapplied within the actual programs and for both the JRP and LRP valuations. And both of these items our understanding has been subsequently corrected in the 2022 valuations. So we'll move on to the next slide. So the first part of the actual audit was to complete a review of the data used in the actual evaluation. And we found that the data used to be reasonable, appropriate, and complete, but we do have a few comments. So as Dan noted earlier, one aspect that we believe is unique to how we perform the data validity review is that we review individual benefit calculations produced by the systems. And the rationale is that when a member commences their benefit, the system has certified the calculated benefit amount and thus the data used in that calculation. We then use that certified data to compare to the data that's actually supplied to the actuary for the actual evaluation to ensure consistency, such that the salary, service, and contributions used by the actuary would produce a benefit in their actual programs similar to the actual benefit received by the member. In addition, we review that the retiree data with the data that's supplied subsequently to the actuary in the following year to ensure that all aspects are being transmitted to the actuary, such as their benefit amounts and how that benefit amount may change in the future upon the death of the retiree or the death of the beneficiary. In all, we reviewed 86 individual benefit calculations, 56 across the systems in KPPA, 15 for TRS, and 15 for JFRS. Now, one item we specifically found was the development of final average compensation for Tier 1 SPRS members, for Tier 1 state police members. And the final average calculation appears to result in an amount that could be higher than the member's typical monthly salary. And thus, it's higher than that's being estimated by the actuary in the actual program. So we recommend a review to determine if a load should be incorporated into the actuarial evaluation for this particular feature. Other considerations for KPPA is when a member retires, a portion of the liability is allocated to both hazardous and non-hazardous valuations based on service with each component. And so we suggest whether the percentage can be provided based on the actual benefit that's determined for each component. In addition, there's no allocation of the liability when the member is an active employee, meaning the entire liability is either considered hazardous or non-hazardous up until that point of retirement. So when the member actually does retire, a loss is occurring on one of the plans where the full allocation, where now the allocation applies when there was no allocation before, and a gain occurs on the plan where the full liability had previously resided.
Another thing we noticed for TRS is that 3 of the 7 active calculations we reviewed had reciprocity service with another system, resulting in additional compensation and service used to determine the member's benefit. But that was not reflected in the actuarial evaluation. As we had a very limited sample, we do suggest that further review is done to determine if some type of load should be incorporated into the valuation or if more information should be gathered.
Okay, so moving on to the next slide. So regarding the actuarial evaluation methods and procedures, we found them to be in compliance with actuarial standards of practice and the funding policy to be in line with actuarial guidance. Specifically in our report, we referenced a white paper that was published by the Conference of Consulting Actuaries several years ago. A few considerations we do offer is for the KPPA systems, the unfunded liability is amortized over a 30-year closed period as of July 1, 2019, and so 28 years were remaining as of the July 1, 2021 valuation. Subsequent changes to the unfunded liability are amortized over 20 years from the date that's calculated. And this methodology is consistent with actuarial guidance. The issue becomes that if actuarial gains have occurred since that initial fresh start base was established from July 1, 2019, that those gains are amortized quicker than that initial base. And then this can result in what we call an effective amortization period being greater than that remaining amortization period, the remaining fresh start amortization period of 28 years. And basically what this means is that the calculated amortization amount is less than if you would calculate a 28-year amortization of the unfunded liability. And so our suggestion is to overlay a minimum amortization payment that's based on and amortizing the unfunded liability over this remaining fresh start amortization period. So 28 years in 2021, 27 years in 2022, up until the point you get to that 20-year period methodology. We also reviewed the allocations for KPPA, the House Bill 8 allocations, as we referred to them, by individual employer. We found one technical issue due to differences in salaries between retirement benefits and insurance benefits in the methodology that was used by GRS, who's the actuary for KPPA. The other suggestion we have is for GRS to include more detail in their report regarding the development of the amortization payments, such that another actuary could match those calculations precisely. And then on JFRS, quickly, since the valuations are completed every other year, we included suggestions for modifying how that second year contribution is being determined to reflect the changes in the cost for older tier members being replaced by the hybrid plan members.
Thanks, Scott. For TRS, we suggest that more clarity be provided regarding any special appropriations and on the overall calculations of the contribution requirements. For the special appropriation, we did receive clarification that the intent was to reduce the employer contributions rather than accelerate a payment of the unfunded liability. On the next slide, I will provide, we do provide more details regarding the calculation of the TRS contributions. When we reviewed the report, we had some confusion on our end about how the contribution rates were developed. Through our analysis and information received from the system and from the actuary, we were able to put together these charts on this slide that we feel are instructive in understanding how the contribution rates were developed. The first chart in the upper left-hand corner shows the statutory contribution rates made by members and employers, which vary by university and non-university, and those hired before or after July 2008. And if you look at all those rates and you take a weighted average, looking at the pay for each of those categories, you end up with a 21.68% contribution rate. And now I'll move over to the chart on the right-hand side, where the 21.68 will appear later. But taking it one step at a time, the gross normal cost is 16.20%, and that was, again, taking a weighted average of the reported rates for university and non-university members. Then there's the unfunded liability contribution, and we calculated that to be at 30.92%. The 30.92% isn't in the actual valuation, but the 1.17 billion number that is there was developed in the actual evaluation, and we were able to match that calculation using the assets, using the liabilities, using the amortization policy. Those two combine for 47.12%. And we feel that's a very fundamental number, and the development of the 47.12% should be included in the actual evaluation report. But when it comes to the 47.12%, you can subtract the 21.68% I talked about being developed on the upper left-hand side, and subtract a special state appropriation of 2.38%, and that's how the actuary determined the 23.05% that is in the actual evaluation report. And so you can feel good that we were able to match the 23.05 by going through this process, and you can be assured that the actuary did the same process. Now, I will say that in the actual evaluation report, the emphasis is on the 16.18%, which is a phased-in contribution rate. Basically, had there not been the experience study, had the old assumptions been used, there would have been a 14.48% rate, having gone through all the same steps on the right-hand side of this slide. And the 16.18% is just 20% of the 14.48% to 23.05%. And our suggestion is that more clarity be added to the reports to denote the total contribution requirement, for instance, the 47.12%, and also the portion that's phased in and the remaining rate that is deficient, and what is the impact on future contribution rates. And one last thing to note is that the actuarial standard of practice number 4 has been revised, and some more disclosure will be required by that ASOP, actuarial standard of practice.
Okay, so on slide 8, so over the next couple slides, we're going to detail our review and suggestions regarding the actuarial assumptions. Before we begin, we do want to note that the current assumptions are reasonable and in compliance with actuarial standards of practice. And as we noted earlier, performing the audit for all the systems at once provided us that unique perspective to compare and contrast how each of the systems and actuaries develop the assumptions. So from what we would think of as a Kentucky holistic perspective, whether we suggest if a consistent framework could be applied to promote consistency across these systems, but while maintaining each system's unique characteristics and establishing the certain assumptions that we list here. And we're going to go through each of these assumptions in the next couple of slides. So on slide 9, we're discussing the inflation and the investment return assumptions. And we independently reviewed the inflation and investment return assumptions using Millman's capital market assumptions as of June 30th, 2021 and June 30th, 2022. The chart shows the inflation assumption, the assumed real return, and then the resulting investment return assumption currently used by each of the systems. Now, recently, we've all heard stories inflation's been at a much higher level, but long-term inflation, the projected inflation over a 30-year period, has really only ticked up a few percentage points. And as seen here on this chart, the JFRS inflation assumption is about 50 basis points higher than TRS, and it's 70 basis points higher than KPPA. And as such, we do recommend a reduction in the inflation assumption of 50 basis points and a corresponding reduction to the investment return assumption for JFRS. Now, since June 30th, 2021, capital market assumptions have increased rather significantly. In our estimation, it was about 60 basis points for the portfolios of the systems. And it's mostly due to the significant increases in bond yields over the past year as interest rates have risen. So as such, the current assumptions are currently below Millman's 50th percentile, meaning that half the time we're projecting out returns above it or half the time we're projecting out returns below that particular level, as of June 30th, 2022, for the KPPA systems and TRS. And therefore, we're not recommending any changes to those assumptions at this time. Now, on slide 10, we're discussing the specific hybrid, what we call the hybrid plan interest crediting rate assumption. And this is the one assumption that we believe each actuary should perform an additional analysis on. And this applies to members who are hired 2014 and later in KPPA and TRS, and applies to their projected cash balance account developed in the actuarial valuation process. The cash balance accounts are credited with interest equal to 75% of the average of the compounded return of the past 5 years that's in excess of 4% plus 4%. So therefore, when that average return is less than 4%, the 4% is still credited. So we performed two analyses to review the specific assumption that the actuaries are using. One was a historical analysis, and we looked at what the current investment portfolios are and estimated what their actual returns were in the past 30 years and applied the formula to those returns. The second one we did was a forward-looking analysis that reflects the distribution of anticipated returns on the portfolios. Now, we know that the investment return assumption is not meant to be the return that's expected to occur each year in the future, but rather it represents an average of potential returns accounting for the portfolio's asset allocations and risk components. And based on these two analyses, we determined that the average excess return is greater than what's currently being used in the actuarial valuation. So when you look at the chart there, the top part of this chart shows what the assumed excess return currently is. So for KERS, non-hazardous, and state police, the actuary is assuming an additional 0.9375%, so a little under 1%. For JFRS, it's as high as 1.875%. And then based on our historical analysis and our forward-looking analysis, for KERS, non-hazardous, our assumptions range between 1.5% and 2.4% for that one specifically. And then the bottom half of the grid, we add in the 4% assumption. And so you can see that, for KERS and non-hazardous, the assumed return on the hybrid plan accounts, the cash balance accounts, is that 4.9375%. And then our calculations are estimating it to be somewhere between the 5.5% and 6.4%. And we show what they are for each of the different systems there. So our recommendation is that each actuarial firm perform similar analysis to determine if an increase in the assumption should occur. And so while the hybrid plan is a relatively small impact on liabilities currently, we believe this change will have an impact on the projected long-term cost of the system. And we'll move on to slide 11.
Great, thank you. And we'll talk about mortality. That is the most significant of the demographic assumptions. We believe that the assumptions used by each of the actuaries are reasonable. Mortality assumptions are typically split into two components. One is the current base rates, and these reflect how long people are living now. It looks at the age, sex characteristics of each individual and looks at how likely the person is to live another year and how long that person is to live. And those are set based on an experience study that looks at what is happening currently. Now, in addition to what's happening currently, there's a second component, and that's how the base rates are going to be expected to change over time. We call this mortality improvement. And each of the actuaries uses different versions of mortality improvement scales produced by the Society of Actuaries. While it does certainly make sense to look at, by system, the base rates, to look at the current assumptions for the base rates, it's not as clear that there should be changes in what the improvement of mortality should be. For instance, with what's being used here, the teacher's mortality is expected to improve less than the other systems. And currently, Society of Actuaries guidance does not really vary the rate of improvement by employee type. Our suggestion is that a similar improvement scale be used for all of the systems. Now, on the base rates themselves, we felt pretty good about our analysis, but we did have a couple of technical considerations. One is the application of the contingent survivors mortality table. The Society of Actuaries research shows that surviving spouses have significantly higher mortality at some of the 60s and 70s type ages than would happen for the beneficiaries prior to the member's death. And the Society of Actuaries specifically cautions against the use of the same table prior to and after the member dies. And we recommend that the actuaries consider that same approach here. The other technical issue refers to the use of one mortality table for both the hazardous and the non-hazardous in the KPPA systems. This seems to be the one and only assumption of consequence that doesn't vary between the hazardous and non-hazardous. And since separate valuations are conducted for hazardous and non-hazardous, we would suggest a review to determine if the experience of each group is statistically different. And it very much might be, because the Society of Actuaries does produce separate tables for safety versus general employees. Other assumptions on the insurance valuations, we suggest consistency be considered for two of the assumptions regarding healthcare trend and aging factors. Again, each of the assumptions used by the actuaries are reasonable, but they do differ, even though in this case the underlying benefits are provided by the Kentucky Employee Health Plan for all members prior to Medicare eligibility. We believe that establishing a consistent framework for setting the trend assumptions, such as using the Society of Actuaries Getson model and aging factors, would provide a more consistent calculation of the liabilities and costs.
And then the other couple things that we noted there on the slide for JFRS, the actuary USI for JFRS used a dual salary increase assumption, effectively 1% assumed salary increases for a 3-year period of time, and then 3.5% year thereafter. In the application of the salary scale, they apply the 1% assumption, what we call backwards, so back to the person's actual date of hire. This has a technical issue in terms of how you allocate the liability to the member's actual to service accrued as of the valuation date. And by using the 1% assumption versus the 3.5% assumption, a higher accrued liability is developed. We weren't sure if that was the intention or not, so we just kind of note it in our report. The second thing that we note is regarding a sizable, what we call as a sizable load, to account for members who retire, or who do not retire, I should say, after termination with LRP, but whose benefits could increase substantially based on non-legislative salaries earned subsequently. And so with such a significant load, effectively we're suggesting if additional data could be provided to the actuary, to JFRS, so that it could be more strategic in the application of any sizable load. 40% is a pretty large load to apply to the liability. The load in of itself appears reasonable based on the analysis that was completed by USI. And then on slide 13, we discuss the results of our parallel valuation. So as noted, we conducted full parallel valuations of the June 30, 2021 liabilities and costs for all the systems and plans on both the retirement and insurance benefits. We independently programmed our valuation system with the data, plan provisions, and actuarial assumptions to perform a match. And our replications indicate no significant deviations from those that were calculated, although we list the 3 specific items here. Now, the first and the third item we had noted earlier, and they've actually been corrected in the subsequent 2022 valuations that have now been released. The other item is that upon retirement, members have the option to choose a joint and survivor annuity with a reduced benefit, or the single life annuity, which is what we would call the maximum option. And if the member chooses the maximum option and dies within a relatively short period of time, a death benefit is still paid to their beneficiary that's equal to the member's contribution balance less the amount of retirement benefits that the member had received. And we estimated that the length of any death benefit is between 32 and 36 months for KPPA, so about 3 years, and 49 months for TRS, about 4 years. Now, since the actuaries are valuing this single life annuity for all active members in the valuation process upon retirement, we suggest they incorporate this additional liability for this death benefit as well. So that concludes our presentation this afternoon. We're happy to take any questions you may have at this time.
Thank you, gentlemen, for that very timely and also accurate report for us. We appreciate the summary. Are there any questions from the members? I know we'll start off with Chairman Higgin has a question, and if anyone else has one, please let me know.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had to find my place here. I wrote down several questions. You talked about a consistent framework for setting assumptions, and you also could you give us some examples of what other states do, and I guess kind of to better explain exactly what you're talking about on that?
Sure. Did you want to?
Sure. Well, it certainly, there is a lot of variation out there. I can speak to the Florida retirement system. Now, there's an assumption conference that takes place every year, and the assumptions for the entire system, it's very different. It's all one system with different membership classes, but there is one set of assumptions. There's one inflation assumption. There's one investment rate of return assumption. There are differences that cause that to be the case, but there is something to be said for inflation for teachers being the same as inflation for other systems. I will also say I work with the Washington state retirement systems, and there again, it's looked holistically, although they do have one separate board for one of their plans. And so in that regard, there are some similarities to what's done here. But the majority of the people, the majority of the systems do use one set of assumptions, particularly for those assumptions that could be universally applied. And I think one other thing I just want to make clear is that we don't want to say, okay, you're going to use the same mortality assumption for each of the systems. For instance, in Florida, there's a separate assumption for teachers. Then there's a separate assumption for safety. There's a separate assumption for general. And that is corresponding to the fact that the Society of Actuaries has done studies that has shown statistically significant differences between those systems. And we certainly would anticipate that would be incorporated. And of course they are incorporated. But when it comes to things like mortality improvement in Florida, there's only one assumption for how much the current mortality is going to improve into future years. So that was kind of a long-winded answer, but I hope it got to your question.
Thank you.
Did you?
I do. Mr. Chairman, is okay, but sure. One of the things you mentioned in your assumptions for the payroll assumptions, and you had that in there. It looked like the systems are using 2.3 to 2.5 as their assumption for payroll increase, and you said that was somewhat appropriate, and that's
Correct.
okay.
Correct. From an inflation assumption perspective, yes. And that's consistent with Millman's current capital market assumptions, and probably has been. I think our capital market assumptions have had inflation about 2.3%. It's been for quite a while. Now, short term, over the next 5 years or so, our inflation assumptions are higher, but then it's anticipated to, over a longer period of time, still be in that 2.35% range at this point in time.
Mr. Chairman, one more, and I noticed you spoke several times through when I read this, reciprocity issues between KPPA and TRS. Could you elaborate a little more on that?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So, when members change systems, they have options, and I'm trying to remember the details specifically, but on TRS, they have options of incorporating their KPPA service and compensation in developing that benefit amount. And in TRS, that accrual rate varies based on their years of service. So by including sort of prior periods of service, it has an impact of increasing their benefit greatly. So it's really trying, and we've seen, I'll say, systems struggle of making sure that the data can be supplied to the actuaries to account for members who might have this prior service. Ohio is one kind of system that comes to mind where they have a reciprocity agreement across their systems, and what's the impact on when the person finally retires. The whole point of the actuarial function is trying to produce benefits that are going to be consistent with what the member actually receives. And so, quote, hidden reciprocity service is something that doesn't actually get reflected in that program. Part of it always comes down as to the extent of, what's the impact of that reciprocity service, and how prevalent is it? So I think our recommendation at this point is, estimate what the prevalence is, estimate what the potential impact is, and then can the actuary incorporate a specific load in their valuation to reflect it?
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have a few more questions, but I'll let you move on to some other.
Mr. Hicks, I believe you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the lens that you're bringing to this. This is really interesting to hear, across the systems there. And I want to just make a note. I appreciate the comment about clarification on special appropriations, and your comment about that. That should be well regarded. Got a question on the mortality improvement scale that you mentioned.
Yes.
I believe in the last experience study for the teachers' retirement system, that was one of the key changes that they've made, was the method by which they were calculating the mortality rate of mostly teaching and school district type of employees. So is the statement in slide 11 that they use the 2020 scale, is that accurate with what they changed recently with the experience study? And you all are recommending that KPPA look at something similar?
Well, I think when it comes to the improvement scale, you're right that the most recent experience studies did incorporate updates to the improvement scale, and they both the JFRS and the TRS went to the latest SOA, Society of Actuaries Mortality Improvement Scale. However, on the teacher's side, there was a belief that improvement would be slower than the improvement implied by the standard most recent table by the Society of Actuaries. And that was not what was done on the JFRS side.
And I was really thinking about the KPPA
Oh,
versus the TRS.
KPPA. Well, there are a couple things that are different about the. Yes, thank you. There are a couple things that are different about the KPPA. For one thing, just simply the timing of the experience study was different, so they didn't have the very latest one. But also there was a use of what they call the ultimate table on the KPPA side. The Society of Actuaries has gotten very complicated with having a select and ultimate table, where for a few years there are different rates that vary by age and by gender as to how much mortality is going to improve, not just what the current rates are, but how much it's going to improve. And what KPPA has done, and Gabriel Roeder-Smith has recommended, and KPPA has done, is to not look at the early fluctuations, but to look at, okay, where is it going to be eventually, and let's assume that's what should be used now.
Thank you. And I think one of the explanations we received, Mr. Chairman, last time was from TRS was that it aligned better with, and they talked about teachers, right?
Right.
Teachers and the demographics of teachers.
Oh, okay.
Both gender, age,
Right.
et cetera. And
Right.
but it also relates actually to this scale that you just described, the 2020 scale.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just to add on, one of the differences between KPPA and TRS that Dan mentioned was the timing of the experience study. And so getting back to the other question of how do you kind of produce consistent framework, aligning the timings of the experience studies. So if all the investment return assumptions are being based on capital market assumptions as of 2023, as of 2024, then you're going to get a little more consistent assumption. As you can imagine, if we were sitting in 2020 versus 2023, you're going to come up with a different assumption based on what you're, based on that timing. So aligning the timing of the experience studies would kind of help with that. When GRS recommended the using of the select table, the Society of Actuaries, the improvement scales were relatively new at that point. We're now about, I think, 7 tables in, 7 years worth in. They were producing mortality improvement scales every single year. And every single year that they had produced them, they lowered what they were projecting the improvement was going to be. And I think personally, and Dan may have a similar experience, but when they first came out with the tables, a lot of actuaries thought that they were somewhat being too conservative, that the projection was too long. And
Too conservative in this context, meaning
Yes.
that people are going to live longer, and that
it's a good thing,
right?
but
Certainly.
it's how you reflect it in the actual valuation process. And as time marched on and the tables came down, the rates of improvement came down, we became, especially in 2020, when they came out with that table, personally felt much more comfortable with the use of those improvement scales. And I think that's why you kind of see with the actuarial firms, TRS and JFRS, that they had used that 2020 scale. Of course, it's important to note, none of that data reflects any impact of COVID. And it's really, over the next couple of years, us as actuaries are all trying to figure out how should we reflect the impact of COVID, if we should reflect it at all. Because when we do the valuations in 2023, it's for the individuals who've survived, right? So how is their mortality going to be any different than what we were assuming prior to 2019?
Thank you. Chairman Tipton, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Porter, Wade, I appreciate you all being here today. Your presentation. I'd like to go back to page 7 of your summary and page 10 of the full audits where it talks about that. But in regard to the TRS and the way they do their valuation method, just want to clarify one thing. I think I'm right in this. The weighted average statutory rate of 21.68, that is a blend of the different rates, because you have a difference between university and non-university, and you have a difference depending on employment rate.
That is absolutely right. It includes both employer and member, and it is blended between university, non-university, pre and post 2008. All those are factored in, and just to make it clear, it includes the employer statutory and the member statutory to get up to a 21.68%.
Okay,
So-
we have a follow-up, Mr. Chair. Also on this chart, you list on the right-hand side, you list the gross normal cost, the unfunded liability contribution, and you total that. So am I correct that the actuarial determined contribution of $1.783.2 billion is the actual cost needed to fund the teacher's retirement system per year?
Based on the funding method for that year, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now I want to get into, if I may, a little bit on the blending, on the valuation. 2-3 years ago, all the systems had plus 20% returns. TRS had I think 29% return, something like that.
Right.
And they smooth it in over 5 years.
Right.
Then the next year, we had big losses during COVID, I think around 20%. So when you do the smoothing in, aren't you really offsetting those huge losses and gains? And is this practice of smoothing in something that other states do, other pension systems do? And could you elaborate a little bit on the benefit, the pros and cons of doing the smoothing in?
Sure.
Yeah, well, I just, first of all, most states do, and most public retirement systems do some kind of smoothing, and I believe that the 5-year smoothing is the most common. There are a lot of different flavors that get done, but the 5 years, as is done in Kentucky, is the most common. And as far as the pros and cons, it's really about contribution rate stability, because the market value fluctuates a great deal, and I mean, that's basically the pro. The The con, I've heard the saying that you can't pay benefits with smooth assets, but that realistically, if we're talking about a long-term funding policy, we feel it makes sense to have an asset smoothing to mitigate the somewhat artificial day-to-day market volatility.
Mr. Chair, one more brief question, and then I'll pass. It's not in your summary, but in page 17 of the full report, you talk about the JFRS system, and you're referring to the non-legislative salary load for LRP, and you're using basically the load is that can be increased by 40%. And for those that don't understand, we have legislative members who go on to other employment in state government, sometimes at much higher salary. So that increases their pension benefits in the LRP system. How do you really determine how much that load? It looks like there's so much fluctuation there and uncertain. How do you really develop a good number for that?
And in essence, that was our concern. If I remember numbers right, I think the liability for the active members was $10 million, I want to say, and then effectively it turns into $14 million because of the load, and that load is applied, to the entire active liability, as well as there's a handful of what we call terminated vested members, and really this provision applies to members who terminate, to the legislators who retired directly from service, commence their benefit at that time. Their benefits is known based on the information. The issue becomes is that when a legislator moves on to other employment within the state government, has a much higher salary in terms of what they're earning, then that higher salary can increase their retirement benefit, and it can actually have a really significant increase. And that's really what it came down to as quote, an outsider. I mean, as actuaries, we probably use loads 2%, 3%, maybe 5%. It's rare that I would ever use a load that's even as high as 10%. You got to really get in this. So for a load to be as high as 40%, now we looked at the analysis that USI performed, the actuary for JFRS, and they kind of showed, here's what we did, and here's the load, here's the extra additional benefits that these members have accrued based on these non-legislative salaries. And then they compared it to all those members, even those who didn't get any, and came up with this 40% load. They showed they had done it a couple different times, and they were pretty similar. So I was somewhat surprised relative to the consistency, because it seems like something that could fluctuate greatly to me as quote, an outsider to it. So.
Chairman Higdon, take us home.
We talk about reciprocity, and you just talked about it with the legislators, and that's something I don't agree with. I'm one of the few that voted against it when it came up for a vote. Anyway, or one of the few remaining, should say that. But we have reciprocity all across the systems. You could have a magistrate that served for 24 years and ran for county judge, and hold that county judge at a much higher rate of pay. You don't mention that in any of the other systems. Is that and I guess technically you could have a classroom teacher for many years and goes on to be a superintendent. Those reciprocity issues are not mentioned in other systems. Should they be?
Effectively. So what I would say is, we kind of talked about, we did a review of individual benefit calculations, and based on that review is really what came out. The members we chose were completely random in many ways. So we just looked at people who had retired during the past year. It's certainly possible if you had looked at every single calculation, you might come up with more members. I'm always surprised with what we do find with the amount of members that we have. If there are, I'll say, additional situations that are prevalent enough that you feel that you should be incorporating it to some degree, I mean, the systems are going to know best because they're going to know their membership best. So it didn't. Nothing else came up in our review based on the calculations that we could see.
I just point that out because you brought it up about the legislative retirement. We understand that, but that's reciprocities across all systems. And you also mentioned, you talked about the reciprocity between like TRS, somebody working TRS for 10 years and then goes over to CERS for 17 and retires. Did you see how we kind of determine, is it to use a high 3 or a high 5 for calculating the final retirement? What other issues did you find when you looked at that?
Yeah, I think it was the additional service. So really, from our standpoint, it comes down to does the actuary know about that prior service? So when they're determining the liability in the actuarial evaluation, are they determining an accurate estimate of the liability for as many individuals as possible? And so it's really the question is that service being supplied? Does the system know, and is that service being supplied to the actuary so they can include it in their functions? To me, that's really the key, is to make sure that any of those kinds of provisions are being accurately funded, and as much as you can do funding while the person is working versus all the funding occurring at the point of retirement.
Also, you mentioned, and I'm not sure what page it was on, I should have marked my pages, but the additional contribution the General Assembly made to pay off the green box dollars. And I think you kind of were curious how that was applied. And I don't know that you got a good answer, or the good answer wasn't in your report. I think you said it was 2.38% of payroll.
Correct. I think, yeah. I think in our review of TRS, there was a special appropriation that was in addition to the statutory. We weren't sure if it was something that was supposed to be in addition to it. It was in addition to the statutory rates, basically, as we understood it, but then which resulted in a reduction in that, quote, additional contribution to comply with that board policy. So once when we understood exactly what it was, and that was why I put the page up, that we tried to put charts in our report so we understood it better. And then, our recommendation is for the actuaries to disclose that information directly into their reports.
One last question, Mr. Chairman. I want to make sure their flight to Kentucky was, we get ask all the questions we can.
Yes, that's why we're here.
You mentioned in House Bill that in House Bill 8, it increased non-HAS liability by 1.8% because of the way they were reporting that. Or is there a dollar figure attached with that?
It was 1.8%, and then let me see if I can get to a page. Okay, so let's see. So for KERS, So I'm thinking it's 260 million, if that's the 1.8, and then for CERS, I think it's similar. It's in the 200 million. I'd probably have to look more detailed to give you a better response of what specifically that was.
So several $1 million increase in liability.
Yeah, I mean, relative to the size of the full plan. So, yeah.
I did see one more note. You mentioned that TRS amortization continued to, negative amortization continued with TRS. I didn't really understand exactly what you meant by that statement.
Well, the negative amortization basically means that the unfunded liability amount is expected to grow as a dollar amount, grow fairly slowly at this point now that it's a 23-year amortization. But that means that the contribution is not enough to pay the interest on the unfunded liability and the normal cost. The combination of the normal cost and the interest on the unfunded liability, it's just a little short of that benchmark, and we call that negative amortization.
I guess in your rate, what we've contracted for, you will take our phone calls for follow-up.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Seeing no other questions, I will mention that the actual report is in our board packets. And as the chairman just mentioned, should anyone have any questions, I'm sure that you gentlemen will be willing to help us out. I'm at least hopeful. I want to thank you for your work on behalf of the board. And if you would pass on to your entire team, our thanks as well. Thank you,
Thank you.
gentlemen.
Great.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for the good questions. We really appreciate it.
Up next, we wanted to give the system, the representatives of the systems that we just heard about a chance to respond. Should you desire to have a response, please come forward now. Bo Craycraft, are you here? I'm sorry. Why don't we start one at a time? That probably will make things simpler. Sorry about that. That's okay. You can come sit with him if you want, but we'll let him start.
Sorry, I didn't know if we were going to do it together or.
That was my fault. Please introduce yourself for the record.
For sure. Bo Craycraft, Executive Director of the Judicial Forum Retirement System. It's good to be here today, and no, comments are pretty limited. First off, just board has not been able to meet since we received the final draft of the report. I had received a draft copy, and it's pretty unchanged from the final report, so we did get an opportunity to talk. So just reflecting from our meeting in January, first off, we're happy to hear that, overall the assessment was positive, and when you look at the larger scale process of the actuarial evaluations, the report was good and positive, so we're thankful for that. We're also thankful for opportunities to improve. And so, as Mr. Porter mentioned, one of the mortality tables was not applied correctly. That was something that our actuary was made aware of and something we were able to implement in 2022. And so, it's always good to have someone take a look, and we felt like, we got both positive in the sense that we're doing a good job, our actuaries are doing a good job, but also there was spots to improve. With regards to the inflation assumption and the return assumption, House Bill 76 was passed during last year's session, and so we're slated to do one of our biennial reviews of our economic assumptions in July as we lead into our 2023 evaluation, so that's going to be on the top of the list. I did do some research, and when our board adjusted their return assumption from 7 to 6.5, which was quite a bit earlier than most plans at that time. They chose to reduce the real return assumption, and they utilize a building block approach. There's two building blocks: inflation and real return. In that particular case, they probably could have spread that reduction across both building blocks, but they chose one. And so I think as a result, now our inflation assumption is a little bit higher just because we haven't made a recent change. And then the last thing I would speak to with regards to the legislative load and the 40%, our actuary would tell you that is not normal, right? They're not doing that with a lot of clients. When we did an experience study in October, the actual results of the load were 36%. So it is abnormal, but it's not unrealistic. I think there's a couple factors that go into play here. One, it's a limited population sample size, right? There's not a ton of folks that are eligible. And so there's not, thousands like there could be at KPPA with reciprocity. It's a smaller group. However, the resulting change in benefit is usually fairly significant and dramatic. So when you have a small number and a significant change, it has a very large impact on the ultimate liability. And so, I think the actuary has contemplated multiple ways of doing this. They just implemented this about a decade ago, and the actual results are not abnormal to that 40% load. So we're definitely going to consider the recommendations, but while it is an abnormal number, it's not unrealistic. So I just wanted to make sure we were clear there.
Anything else?
Any
Thanks for
questions?
no. Well, I'll ask any questions from the board. Seeing none, do thank you for your input. Rebecca, you want to try again? Welcome, and as usual, if you would just introduce yourself for the records, and the floor is yours.
Sure. Good afternoon. I'm Rebecca Adkins. I'm the Deputy Executive Director for Kentucky Public Pensions Authority.
Hi, and I'm Erin Surratt. I'm the Executive Director of the Office of Benefits at the Kentucky Public Pensions Authority.
Like Bo, I want to say thank you to Milliman. They were really professional. They gave us great deadlines. They were very patient. We especially worked with Scott Porter and Aaron Shapiro, and we really appreciated them. We certainly appreciate the opportunity for an audit. Audits are always good. We are, when we got the first draft, and I agree with Bo, it didn't change significantly when the final came out. We shared it, of course, it was embargoed, so we shared it just with the leadership. So the CERS CEO, Ed Owens, who is here, the KRS CEO, John Chilton, who is here, my boss, the KPPA Executive Director, David Eager, our board chair, Jerry Powell, of the KPPA board chair, Jerry Powell, and we, Danny White and Janie Shaw, who were instrumental answering questions for Scott and Aaron, were also a part of. We looked at it together. We provided in writing a response about January 26th, which we'll be happy to provide to you guys to see our response. It was only a couple pages long. In general, we are thrilled with this report. It's terrific. We think it provides a great level of assurance to our members and to you guys and oversight that our valuations are accurate and appropriate for our plans. In the executive summary that you guys are looking at, there are 7 primary conclusions. The first one says, this is quoting from the report, audit provides a high level of assurance that the results of the valuation reasonably reflect the aggregate liabilities of each system. We're very happy with that. If you keep reading through the report, you'll also see quotes like, overall, we believe that the June 30, 2021 actual valuation reports are reasonable and appropriate for the intended uses of these reports. That's on page 4. On page 28, speaking of the benefit calculations for retirees, this degree of matching indicates a very high quality retiree data is being provided to the actuary by each system. That's something that always keeps me up at night when we're talking about providing data to the actuaries. Is it right? Is it accurate? Pages 100 through 113, you will find 6 places, because 3 for pension and 3 for insurance, that say we view the results as a successful replication of Milliman of GRS's results. So I think we have a clean bill of health here, and we're very excited about all of that. I think that speaks well to our processes and our data and the abilities of GRS to understand our systems and provide us good stats. The second recommendation from Milliman is this consistent framework and the consideration of picking some of the assumptions to be a little more uniform across all systems. Our response is on page 4 in there. It is the funded statuses, risk tolerances, liquidity needs, member and retiree demographics, and the asset allocations vary by system. Therefore, the assumptions need to be unique to each of these systems. Since setting assumptions is unique and specific to each of these plans, that was one of the primary reasons that we now have the governance structure that we had that began in 2021. This appears to be a little bit of a reversal of that thought process. So while we have not shared this with the board yet, because of course it was embargoed until you all see it, our boards will see it and they'll look at that closely. The remaining issues that have something to do with KBPA 3, 5, and 6, and then the rest of the report has sprinkled throughout it a plethora of more minor recommendations that just didn't hit the executive summary. We certainly are committed to looking at all of it and seriously considering that. GRS is already plowing through some of that. The boards will look at all of that and consider each recommendation.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the board? Seeing none, thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Last but not least, Bo Barnes.
Good afternoon. Bo Barnes. I serve as Deputy Executive Secretary and as General Counsel for the Teachers Retirement System. Thank you for the opportunity to make a brief comment about the actuarial audit, and I will try to be as brief as I can be because I know we have a lot of other things on the agenda. We certainly appreciate the professionalism of Millman and working with them. It was a good relationship working with them, and we want to thank them for the very thorough work that they did in conducting a level 1 full scope audit. We certainly are very pleased that they found that the TRS actuary is projecting the liabilities of the retirement system correctly, that the TRS independent actuary is using reasonable and appropriate actuarial assumptions that are consistent with the actuarial standards of practice. We did note one sole exception to the audit report, and that sole exception is noted by Milliman in the report that they submitted to this board. And that sole exception is a suggestion that the retirement systems use a similar framework for developing actuarial assumptions. And as was noted by KPPA, we are very, very different retirement systems in many, many ways. Demographics, just one example of demographics. Our system is 70% female. Women on average live longer than men. There are also differences in funding levels, risk tolerance, asset allocation, and approach to investments. All of those things. We're a system whose membership is 95% of which do not participate in Social Security. So in regard to our membership, we are largely a Social Security replacement plan for our teachers. And in addition to those differences, we have the findings that concluded that the assumptions developed by the actuaries are reasonable and appropriate. So we would be moving from something that is working now to something new that, as noted in the audit report, would require complexity in even moving to. One of the concerns we have here is, furthermore, that in moving to a new system like that, particularly if the assumptions were to be set by one entity, that we are opening up the possibility that we are going to have a system that's going to move and drive towards very similar and even identical assumptions. And that would seem that we would be actually consolidating risk for the Commonwealth with similar and identical assumptions. In other words, putting all of our actuarial eggs in one basket. And of course, those eggs represent tens of billions of dollars. So that is a concern that we have, and we feel like we need to note that if we were to use very similar or identical assumptions set by one entity particularly, that we do consolidate, not spread risk for the Commonwealth. And very respectfully, we made that one sole exception to the audit report. Otherwise, we were extremely happy with it. It was a very clean report and very reassuring for our members that we have such a clean audit report. So again, thank you for the opportunity to briefly comment.
Thank you, bro. I would just say note your exception. I would add to that it seems to me that recommendation on their part is simply food for thought. And I think we need to revisit it down the road a little bit. We can talk offline a little bit more about it and get more of a consensus, but it's something we can talk about down the road. Any questions from the board? Seeing none, thank you, Bo.
Thank you.
All right, the next item's on the agenda, changing directions a bit, is a discussion of the bills coming up in this General Assembly that impact pensions or could impact pensions. We have several bills, so we're going to move them as quickly as we can. The first one up is Representative Sharp, if you would come forward. And while he's coming forward, I would just mention that the purpose of us hearing these bills today is for vetting with respect to pension applicability or impact. We're not here to discuss pluses or minuses of the bill. That's the purpose of the standing committees. Today, we simply want to look from the perspective of pensions as to how these bills might or might not impact. With that being the case, I will open it to Representative Sharp. I will say, Treasurer Ball, it's very good to see you again, and we look forward to hearing from you. Representative Sharp, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Higdon, and the Oversight Board. I appreciate you guys seeing us today. And, of course, we have Treasurer Ball here with us. and we have her counsel. One of the things that this bill is addressing is some issues that have come up recently by major investment firms to where they're starting to invest more on a political and ideological level. So what we wanted to do is kind of look out for the employees in our pension plans to make sure that they're getting the maximum returns possible. So what this bill does is it basically says that if you're going to invest our pension plans, you must invest it based on a fiduciary return and not a political or an ideological basis. The traditional, and that's the traditional returns that we have done. And that's the way it's been done for years. And again, this is a recent development. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the treasurer here.
Just by way of background, when I first became treasurer, this was talked about a lot at state treasurers meetings. And I know Auditor Harmon has also been a part of conversations where this has come up quite a bit. And I thought it was novelty, it was academic, it was something that was not really going to be actually available to state pension systems. But in the last couple of years, this has become a major issue. And like Representative Sharp has just said, once upon a time, investments were about getting good returns. And that's what you think of when you think of pensions. You think it's about making sure you have money when you retire. But the problem with ESG is that it looks at different purposes besides just getting good returns. It's environmental, social, and government. That's what ESG stands for. And it's really been a way to push certain ideological perspectives, trying to get some ideological outcomes. And it's using dollars to push industries the way that certain people want them to go. And I think that it's contrary to what we need to do as Kentuckians. We need to make sure we're protecting our pensions, we're getting good returns. We don't need to play around with ideologies. So I'm very encouraged to see this. I think that it's already progressing on its way in other areas, but I'm glad that I have an opportunity to discuss it with all of you so you have some information about what this is and what it would do.
Chairman Tipton, maybe you have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you all being here. We had a very similar bill to this, I believe, last month that we heard from the Senate side. And I do have a definition, a question about a definition. I looked it up, but for the record, what does pecuniary, I can't even pronounce it, pecuniary mean?
Money.
Okay, just want everybody to understand we're talking about items that impact fiscal issues.
Yes, that is correct. It's just saying that these returns, what you're getting out of this, has to be financial. You're not pushing an ideological agenda.
Any other questions? Senator Byrd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, so here's the question that I'm having trouble with, and I want somebody to assure me that we are keeping everything in mind when we make these decisions. As a state, when we invest state-held money, and the goal is to make as much profit as possible in the short term, how are we accounting for the long-term costs to the state that are the results of these decision-making processes and offset those costs against the short-term gain of an additional 2% return? Nobody has been able to explain to me, how do we look at what it's going to cost us as a state to fix some of the commercial ravage that has been happening in this state, that ultimately we are responsible for fixing, even though we're supporting businesses that have created this finance for us. So how do you balance those when you're talking about state-funded investment, short-term return versus long-term costs?
If I understand the question, I think the question is, you're asking, if we're getting good returns, are we not looking at the way we want society to go? And I would argue that society is policy related, which is what this body or the members of this body are involved with, policy returns. But you want your investments to be about good investments, getting good returns. So you look at it in a long-term perspective, of course, and you look at it in a short-term perspective, but it's about the pecuniary, making sure that you're having good returns, that people can retire when they want to retire. Anything else is introducing problematic areas into investments, because you're saying, I want to see society go to a certain way. I want to see companies operate a certain way, and those are policy issues. Those should not be investment issues. So I would argue that those are not appropriate for investments. There's wonderful ways to deal with those issues, and they're policy related.
Thank you. Chairman Higdon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Treasurer Ball. There was a little, I guess, misunderstanding about a report that CERS and KERS were supposed to get back to you on. I just want to tell you, I was in a meeting, I think Friday, with Brittany, and she's remarkable, her knowledge of the retirement system and what we're supposed to be doing. And I just want to commend her for her great work in helping us understand exactly what it was that we needed to do. So thank you, Brittany.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. Seeing no further questions? Oh, sorry. Auditor Harmon, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Treasurer Ball, Representative Sharp, we appreciate you all coming forward. Just a quick question on this particular bill. I know currently it's already required Kentucky law for our investments to make a fiduciary responsibility. Does this particular law or bill, what's the goal of this bill? Is it to tighten up even the proxy voting? Because I know that's been a concern of yours and mine both when it comes to proxy voting. Is that primarily what this does, or does it do something else as well?
It's a good question. It offers some clarification when it comes to ESG and the fiduciary duties. It does expand fiduciary duties to asset managers. They are already under fiduciary laws, but it just clarifies that you cannot use Kentucky's dollars, Kentucky's taxpayer dollars, Kentucky's pension dollars to push certain ideologies. So it has a fiduciary aspect to it. Some of it is clarification, and then there is a proxy element to it as well.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any further questions?
Can I, just to,
Leader?
Mr. Chairman, how do you determine whether or not it's controversial in terms of the politics versus what's best to invest in some areas?
Right.
I mean, I don't want this to come into a political thing, and it sounds like some of this is.
I don't want it to be political either. In fact, that's actually been my great concern, is that we don't get into political areas. It is just about getting good returns. So the language in the statute actually tries to spell it out in a way that will give some guardrails to it. And it says pecuniary factor means a consideration having a direct and material connection to the financial risk or financial return of an investment. So I think that provides the guardrails and the clarity, so that you're saying you're not going to go into whatever kind of political issue you want, whether it's the right or the left or anything else.
And you want the best returns. That's the bottom line, is the best return.
Yes, that is correct. And if it's within investment judgment that this is a good return, using traditional ways of evaluating something, then
So how do
then
you
it will be that way.
determine? Okay, just to ask how do you determine if they're investing based on what is best for the returns versus someone taking it as a political way of not participate? I mean, how can you determine that?
So some of this is informed about the way investments are operating right now. So this is a world that I live in, and we're hearing a lot of commentary about invest this way, don't invest this way, use this asset manager, not this one, because they are trying to, for example, put out the coal industry or eliminate the fossil fuel industry in general. So a lot of that is informed by language that we are actually hearing from people in the investment world. If it is a traditional pecuniary, this is a good investment because I'm getting a good return, it will look like that. It's much more what you're used to seeing. But we are seeing a lot of language from people saying, hey, we're actually doing this for these ideological reasons. Most of the time, they're actually labeled ESG. Many times, they're actually labeled ESG funds. And I'll tell you, one thing to be aware of when it comes to ESG funds is they have very high fees. I think it's 43% higher on average than traditional fees that you get when it comes to asset managers. So there has been an incentive. In fact, some people feel like some of this is trying to just earn some money. That it's kind of a way to get people to pay more because they get more fees. So just to help you understand this, if it is a traditional investment, if it's pecuniary, it will look like it. If it's ESG, it will look like it.
And just to clarify, I think the bill does a good job at answering your question, Representative Graham. So specifically, we've talked about pecuniary factors have to have a direct and material connection to financial risk or financial return of an investment. And then we define material connection. And we say that a material connection is established if there is a substantial likelihood that a reasonable investor would consider it important in determining the financial risk or the financial return of an investment, as opposed to looking at how a 0.5 degree change in temperature could potentially affect an investment 50 years from now in a non-quantifiable way. We're specifically looking at hard numbers and the material and direct connection to those hard numbers.
I just think we better be very careful on how we pursue this. Obviously, we want the best return as we possibly can, with the politics being out of it, or just because you don't agree with it, but it's showing that it is doing well. I just want to make sure that we will proceed with doing what's right by getting the best return possible.
We are on the same page.
Now, I'm not saying going out to invest in Russian kind of things, but I'm saying to do what's right by the investment method by which we approach and not make politics the part of it.
Totally agree. We're on the exact same page. And I think this language puts the guardrails in to do that.
Thank you for the questions. I kind of feel like we're maybe moving into questions that will be asked during committees and on the floor. Are there any more questions specifically pertaining to impact on pensions at this time? Seeing none, I want to thank all of you for coming in and taking your time to present this to us. I know there will be probably a very robust conversation as we move forward with your bill. But I appreciate you letting us know, this board know what the bill's about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Oversight Board.
This time I will turn the gavel over to Chairman Higdon so that I can do what I need to do next.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, you're going to present from here.
Yes, sir.
Identify yourself for the record and please proceed.
Representative DJ Johnson, 13th District, State Representative, and I'm here today to present House Bill 328, which is a measure brought to me by a small number of police officers, and it relates to their participation date in the KPPA systems, which in turn impacts the benefits they're eligible to receive upon retirement. The officers in question signed an agreement with a local city to undergo training with the Department of Criminal Justice Training through an old federal program known as the Police Corps program. The benefit to the city was that cost of the training would be paid for these new recruits, who would then go on to serve as a local police officer in their department. In other words, they received the training under federal funds, but then worked with local police departments once they finished the training. At this time, the individuals were promised that they would be enrolled in the retirement system at the beginning of their training, much like any other police recruit. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, they were not, and their participation date in the KPPA system is after July 1, 2003, which impacts their retirement benefits. House Bill 328, the measure before you, corrects this wrong by making their participation date the date they entered training at DOCJT. As far as the impact on the systems, there are 14 police recruits this impacts, and KPPA has stated that there is no discernible cost to the system. In fact, we just received a written report stating the same, that effectively there is no statistical impact to the systems. That being the case, I would answer any questions you might have.
Any questions? Okay. Seeing none, Mr. Chairman, I turn the gavel back over to you.
House Bill 587 is next. Chairman Weber, would you come forward, please? If you both introduce yourself for the record, please.
Russell Weber, State Representative, 26th District.
Brianna Carroll, Director of Public Affairs, Kentucky League of Cities.
Mr. Chairman, you asked me to keep this brief, and I will. House Bill 587 adds the internal auditor as someone who may be appointed or contracted from the Kentucky Public Pension Authority. It also says the internal auditor shall report directly to the trustees of the Kentucky Public Pensions Authority to perform internal audit functions as directed by the authority.
Thank you, sir. Do we have any questions? So I'll just ask one very briefly. Do you see any impact on the current retirement systems fiscally or in any way from that perspective?
It does remove the employee from 18A.
Okay. I think I understood that. Any further questions? Well, thank you very much. Yes, sir. Chairman Tipton.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up. So really what we're doing, we have an 18A employee, and then the position would be an internal auditor appointed by KPPA, not subject to the salary guidelines. Is that correct? Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Hicks?
Yeah, just to confirm, just like financial institutions such as the credit unions, right? Talking about having an internal audit function that reports to the Board of Trustees, right, and is not reporting obviously to the CEO or the executive director.
You're exactly correct, yes.
Thank you.
I would just comment, in keeping with my comments earlier about a second set of eyes, and we do not need to look over each other's shoulders like big brothers all the time, but a second set of eyes is always beneficial just to make sure we're on the right track. Any other questions? So, Brianna, Chairman Weber, appreciate your time. Thank you very much. This time, I will turn it over to, I won't turn it over to, but I will introduce Chairman Higdon. He has two actions for us to consider today. So if you'd like to introduce yourself yet again, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jimmy Higdon, State Senator, Co-Chair, PPOB. Mr. Chairman, I have two bills, fairly simple bills. One of them, the Senate Bill 128, is an act relating to sick leave reporting for teachers' retirement systems. It would require each school district to report for the financial year ending June 30, 2023, and each fiscal year thereafter, the sick leave balances for each TRS member and district employees, including the amount of sick leave accrued at the beginning of the year and the amount used during the year. This bill would require annual actuarial valuation by the actuary. And that's plain and simple what it says.
Yes, sir. Any questions?
And primarily,
go ahead, Senator.
Primarily the reason for this, in a question of the actuary, what is the liability for sick days? They could only give us an estimate because the actuary said they don't know what the amount is until the employee retires or the teacher retires. So I think it's beneficial to us as an oversight committee and for the system to know exactly what the liability is. That's it on that one.
Okay. Any questions? Thank you for your input. And the second one?
The second one is a Senate Joint Resolution 83, and it directs the establishment of a Public Pension Administration Advisory Committee of the PPOB to evaluate options for coordinating, consolidating actuarial and investments or the general administrative service among the state administered retirement systems and examining additional legislative or administrative actions that may be necessary to clearly define the roles of KERS and CERS and their Board of Trustees and the shared administrative entity of the two boards known as KPPA. And they'll report their findings back to PPOB on December the 1st. And Mr. Chairman, we spent money on a very good audit of the systems, and we will use, if this passes and we do the subcommittee, I'm sure we'll spend a lot of time reviewing the suggestions and recommendations made by this audit.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the board? Mr. Hicks, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the purpose for which you're pursuing this. I think it's a good idea. Just kind of ask a question. Would you consider making this a proposal that this board create that advisory committee, since the statute does permit that?
It is. It says, it talks about the PPOB, a subcommittee of PPOB.
Oh, I'm just saying, since you guys are very busy in this, in this short session, that this board already has the authority to do that without the resolution.
Okay, well.
Just a thought. I like the idea, though.
True. But wanted to get on, and I guess on paper and in guidance on what it is exactly that we're looking at. So when we do the subcommittee, we're not chasing after down different rabbit holes, because there's a lot of them we can go down. And appreciate the question.
Anyone else? Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
I'm going to presume that any of the board members who come up with a question for any of the presenters today, certainly feel free to ask those questions, and I'm sure they'll get back to us. One final item that's not actually on the agenda, but as we wrap up, I just want to let you know that there is a one-page handout that the staff has. It's referencing House Bill 506, sponsored by Chairman Walker Thomas. This particular information is referencing a bill that has already previously been heard before the board, but he's made some significant modifications to it, so we wanted to share that information with you. And again, should you have any concerns or questions, please feel free to ask the bill sponsor. Seeing no other business before the board, we are adjourned.